Imagine for a second, right, that you find a ghost living in your attic.
Okay, yeah.
Most people, they would just run away. They'd call a priest or maybe put the house on the market immediately.
I mean, that would be my first instinct, definitely.
Right. But imagine that instead of running, your very first instinct is to try and, draft that ghost into the military.
It is a profoundly bizarre reaction.
Yeah.
But I think, we are fundamentally uncomfortable with the unexplained.
Yeah.
When faced with a mystery that just breaks all the rules of reality, our instinct isn't to sit and observe it. Our instinct is to try and control it.
And weaponize it, which is the exact premise of our deep dive for you today.
Absolutely.
We are exploring a truly massive effort during the Cold War where global superpowers actually tried to militarize the paranormal.
Which still sounds crazy to say out loud.
It really does. But more importantly, we want to look at what this attempt reveals about the limits of human understanding. We have this incredible stack of material today for you to unpack. Declassified CIA documents, the 1995 American Institutes for Research report, some highly theoretical academic papers on decision augmentation theory, and historical analyses of both U.S. and Soviet parapsychology.
It is a mountain of data.
It really is. So the overarching theme for our deep dive today is rationalizing the impossible. Cold War psychics, cognitive gravity, and the human brain's refusal to accept a mystery.
That is a perfect title for it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Why was the very first instinct of top military brass to weaponize something they couldn't even comprehend?
Well, to understand that reaction, you really have to look at the geopolitical climate of the 1970s. Because the human mind basically hates a vacuum of information.
Oh, for sure.
And during the Cold War, the United States intelligence community suddenly realized they were staring into this massive, terrifying vacuum.
Yeah, because they started receiving these intelligence reports, right? Indicating that the Soviet Union was pouring roughly 60 million rubles a year into what they called psychotronic research.
Exactly.
Psychotronic. I mean, it sounds like a bad science fiction movie from the 50s.
It really does.
Let's actually define that for a second, because the terminology here really matters. What exactly did the intelligence community mean by psychotronics?
So it was essentially the Soviet term for parapsychology, but, framed through a strict technological lens.
Right.
To the U.S. intelligence community, hearing that term and seeing that massive budget, it signaled a potential psychic gap.
Like the missile gap.
Exactly. Just like the missile gap or the space race. The overwhelming fear was that the Soviets were developing a strategic capability that the United States completely lacked.
Right.
And the paranoia over this potential gap directly drove the creation of a series of secret CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency programs.
We're talking about projects with names like Scannet, Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, and ultimately the infamous Stargate Project.
Right, Stargate.
The physical reality of those programs is almost comical when you compare it to the grand, scary names. I mean, we're talking about a tiny, incredibly niche operation run out of a leaky wooden barracks at Fort Meade in Maryland.
Yeah, it wasn't exactly a glamorous underground bunker.
Not at all. But it wasn't just a blip on the radar either. It eventually spanned over 2 decades and run through a $20 million budget. It went all the way to the Oval Office.
That's the part that always gets me.
Right. In 1980, President Jimmy Carter received a briefing where the CIA director reported using a California psychic to help locate a missing plane.
Which is wild.
But I have to push back on this a bit, though. Were the guys holding the nuclear codes genuinely terrified of a psychic gap? Did they actually sit in the Pentagon and worry the Soviets could read their minds from Moscow?
Well, the uncertainty was the real terror. I mean, they weren't sure what to think, and a superpower just cannot abide an unknown variable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The geopolitics of psychoenergetics, which was the umbrella term they used for the intersection of psychological phenomena and energy fields, it reveals a stark contrast in how the two rival nations approached the impossible.
Okay, how so?
Well, the Soviets sought strictly materialistic physical explanations. Their scientific establishment demanded that if psychic phenomena existed, they had to be driven by a physical particle or an energy wave.
And you see that purely physical approach in some incredibly strange Soviet experiments. Like, for instance, Dr. Y.A. Kolodov decided to test the effects of constant magnetic fields on rabbits.
Right, the rabbit experiment.
I was trying to wrap my head around this. He was essentially pulsing magnetic fields into rabbit brains to see if the central nervous system would react without any normal sensory input.
Yeah.
He was literally trying to prove that telepathy was just a form of electromagnetic radiation.
Exactly. And then you have Robert Pavlita, who built literal, physical, psychotronic generator.
Wait, actual machines?
Yes. Pavlidis generators are a perfect example of this materialist mindset. He was constructing these intricate metal boxes and geometric shapes, genuinely believing they could gather and store biological energy from living things.
That sounds like a battery for souls.
Pretty much. And then he thought he could use that stored energy to turn a dial or magnetize a non-magnetic object.
Wow. And the most extreme example might be Dr. Francesca Cahuta. He was a Czech researcher working within the Soviet sphere who theorized the existence of what he called mentions.
Oh, the mentions, yeah.
Let me get this straight. He was proposing literal particles of thought, like particles with their own rest mass and energy equations.
He was. He was attempting to map the paranormal completely onto classical physics.
Unbelievable.
Because if a thought can influence matter, Cahuta reasoned, the thought itself must be a physical particle governed by Newtonian rules.
Okay.
Now, contrast that deep theoretical obsession with the United States. The American approach was overwhelmingly, sometimes ruthlessly, pragmatic.
Right, they just wanted results.
Exactly. The military commanders overseeing Stargate didn't necessarily care about the underlying physics. They didn't care if it was a particle, a wave, or magic. They just wanted operational intelligence.
Which naturally led to some truly surreal moments in the U.S. military. I mean, Major General Albert Stulvine, the head of U.S. Army Intelligence Command, was so entirely convinced by these phenomena that he required his battalion commanders to learn how to bend spoons.
Yeah, spoon bending as a military requirement.
He personally attempted to walk through walls in his office, believing his mind could slip his atoms through the plaster.
And while walking into a wall sounds absurd to us, Stubblebine's actions highlight a critical military necessity.
Which was?
Well, for psychic phenomena to be a strategic asset, the military needed it to be repeatable and teachable.
Ah, right.
They couldn't rely on random, unpredictable flashes of intuition from a gifted civilian. They needed a reliable, standardized system.
So the Soviets are trying to build physical psychic radios with mentions, and the Americans have generals throwing themselves at drywall.
Yeah, pretty much.
Both sides were desperate to put a steering wheel in a hurricane. They needed to standardize the supernatural.
And that attempt at standardization really took root at the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. The military tasked physicists Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ with forcing rigorous scientific protocols onto these deeply anomalous phenomena.
This introduces a major player in this history, Ingo Swann. He helped develop an incredibly rigid protocol called Coordinate Remote Viewing, or CRV.
Right.
The goal was to take this wild, unpredictable human ability and turn it into a sterile step-by-step manual. Can you walk us through how CRV actually functioned? Because it wasn't just closing your eyes and guessing.
No, not at all. It was highly structured to prevent the conscious mind from interfering. A viewer would be given nothing but geographical coordinates, just numbers.
Just a latitude and longitude.
Exactly. They would quickly draw a spontaneous sketch, an ideogram, capturing their very first sensory flash. Then they would go through strict stages, recording raw sensory data like textures, temperatures, and smells before moving on to dimensional shapes. And they were expressly forbidden from naming the object right away to prevent their imagination from filling in the blanks.
And Swann had some wild successes using this rigid protocol. I mean, before NASA's Pioneer 10 probe ever reached Jupiter, Swann viewed the planet in a session and correctly described it as having a crystal ring around it.
Yeah, which completely shocked the scientific community when the probe later confirmed it.
Swann's successes really forced researchers to grapple with two very different paths to explaining the impossible.
It did.
Historically, people categorized psychic phenomena under an influence model. This is the classic idea of psychokinesis, where the mind exerts a physical, mechanical force over matter like bending a spoon or moving a pencil.
Right.
But the data coming out of SRI began shifting the paradigm entirely toward an information model.
And this shift is where we run into Edwin May's work in something called decision augmentation theory, or DMT.
I spent a lot of time trying to digest this concept because it kind of turns everything we think about the paranormal upside down.
It really does. DAT completely removes the mind over matter concept and replaces it with mind navigating information.
Okay, explain that.
Let's say a subject in a lab is asked to influence a random number generator to produce more ones than zeros.
Like a machine.
Right. According to DAT, the subject isn't actually emitting a physical force to alter the machine's electronic output. Instead, anomalous phenomena act as a subconscious informational selection process.
Let me try an analogy to see if I have the mechanics of this right.
Go for it.
So according to DAT, psychics aren't using, like, a Jedi tractor beam to physically manipulate the random number generator. It's more like they have a subconscious spoiler alert for the immediate future.
A spoiler alert. Yeah.
Right, and they just know exactly the right microsecond to push the button to get the result they want. They're augmenting their normal decision-making with anomalous information.
That is a very accurate way to visualize it. It's an informational edge, not a physical force.
Fascinating.
And this directly connects to another theory May and his colleagues utilized, involving Shannon entropy.
Oh, right, from information theory.
Exactly. In this context, the research suggested that remote viewing targets with high entropy meaning locations undergoing dynamic, unpredictable change, like a nuclear test site, were significantly easier to view than static, boring targets, like an empty parking lot.
Because the human sensory system, even anomalously, is wired to notice change.
Precisely.
Okay, but having a spoiler alert for a random number generator in a controlled laboratory is one thing. Does standardizing this actually translate to real-world intelligence gathering?
That's the million-dollar question.
I mean, finding a stolen file or a hidden hostage is infinitely more complex than pushing a button at the right time.
And that exact question brings us to the paradox that ultimately killed the Stargate Project. In 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research, the AR, to evaluate the entire two-decade program.
And this comprehensive review led to a massive, fundamental clash between two of the primary reviewers, right? Statistician Jessica Utz and skeptical psychologist Ray Hyman.
Yes. Utz looked at the raw data and argued that an anomaly was mathematically and statistically proven.
Yeah, she pointed out that these results weren't just isolated to a leaky barracks. They had been replicated in independent university settings, specifically the Peer Lab at Princeton.
The Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab, yeah.
They spent years having people try to mentally influence machines, and Utz saw a clear, persistent statistical bump in the data.
But Ray Hyman argued the complete opposite. He maintained that a statistical anomaly does not automatically equal proof of psychic powers.
Right. Correlation isn't causation.
Exactly. He cited vague data sets, methodological flaws in how the targets were judged, and a lack of true, flawless, independent replication.
The fatal flaw for the intelligence community, however, wasn't really the academic debate over statistics, was it? It was utility.
Operational utility, yes.
There were some remarkable, highly publicized claims over the years. Like, a famous one involved a remote viewer named Rosemary Smith, who allegedly found a lost Soviet spy plane in the jungles of Africa using nothing but a map and a photograph.
Right.
But when you look at the whole program, the overall intelligence gathered over 20 years was considered vague, highly ambiguous, and yielded basically zero actionable intelligence.
That was the AR's final conclusion.
I am stuck on this paradox, though. How can something be mathematically, statistically significant according to a statistician, but completely useless in the real world? If the anomaly exists, shouldn't it be helpful?
Well, the gap between a statistical edge and operational precision is massive. Consider this. In a controlled laboratory, if you guess a hidden card correctly, 53% of the time over tens of thousands of trials, when pure chance dictates you should only get 50%.
That's a huge deal.
That 3% difference is a mathematical earthquake. It proves something beyond chance is happening. But out in the real world, a 53% accuracy rate is functionally useless.
Oh, I see.
A general cannot authorize a multi-million-dollar military strike or risk a covert team's lives based on a vague, dreamlike impression that only has a 3% better chance of being right than a coin flip.
Because the military runs on precision, not slight statistical edges.
Exactly. Consequently, finding it operationally useless, the CIA officially terminated the Stargate Project in 1995.
Which leaves us with this incredible unresolved tension. The Cold War ended, the project shuttered, but the data is still just sitting there heavily debated.
Yeah.
And this is where the history sort of stops being about military strategy and becomes an exploration of human psychology. It's about how both believers and skeptics construct highly elaborate mental narratives to deal with mysteries.
And both sides of the debate fall prey to deep traps of pattern recognition. Believers frequently fall into magical thinking.
Right.
When you start believing your thoughts can alter reality, you start seeing connections everywhere.
There's a tragic example of that in the parapsychology community, right? When a remote viewer made an unsubstantiated claim that a massive spacecraft was trailing behind the Hale-Bopp comet.
Yes. That anomalous claim was absorbed by the Heaven's Gate cult and correlated with their tragic mass suicide. It demonstrates the dangerous leap from an unexplained feeling to a rigid, literal belief.
But the skeptics fall into their own traps, driven by what is termed rational gravity or cognitive gravity.
Right.
Rational gravity is the brain's intense, almost magnetic pull toward established, comfortable paradigms. I mean, think about your own life for a second. Think about when someone presents you with facts that completely contradict your deeply held political beliefs.
Your brain scrambles.
It does. It scrambles to invent a reason those facts are wrong, right? You justify, you deflect. That's rational gravity in action.
And skeptics employ sophisticated psychological concepts to maintain that gravity. Psychologist David Marks, for instance, uses the concept of subjective validation.
Which is what, exactly?
It's our natural human tendency to see what we want to see in vague data, like reading a horoscope.
Yeah.
You make it fit your life. Skeptics also point to sensory linkage, assuming the remote viewer must have unconsciously overheard a clue or seen a reflection. They use these very real psychological tools to retroactively explain away every single hit produced by the Stargate program.
Which introduces an amazing psychological concept, the phantom narrative.
I love this concept.
It's so interesting. A phantom narrative describes how critics will often build highly speculative alternative storylines purely to avoid accepting an anomalous result.
Yeah.
They will assume massive fraud or hidden earpieces or incredibly complex cheating methods, even when there's absolutely zero direct evidence of cheating, simply because the alternative that a psychic phenomenon might have actually occurred violates their rational gravity.
It's a defense mechanism.
It's like believers see a shadow in the hallway and call it a ghost, but skeptics see a shadow and invent a highly complex theoretical system of hidden mirrors and projectors just to prove it isn't a ghost. Both sides are writing a phantom narrative.
Because it's a fundamental discomfort with saying, I don't know. And this brings us to the tools skeptics use to enforce this rational gravity, and how those tools can actually stifle genuine scientific inquiry.
Like Occam's razor.
Yes. Skeptics frequently invoke Occam's razor, the philosophical principle, stating that the simplest explanation is usually the correct one.
Right.
Therefore, they argue, it is infinitely simpler to assume someone lied or a spreadsheet had an error than it is to completely rewrite the laws of physics to accommodate telepathy.
But is that a fair use of the tool? Is Occam's razor being misused to preemptively shut down the investigation of anomalies?
Some researchers definitely think so.
We see this intense adversarial relationship constantly in this space. Think of James Randi's famous $1 Million Challenge, offering a massive payout to anyone who could prove psychic ability under his specific, very hostile test conditions.
Or the Project Alpha hoax.
Oh, yeah, where magicians deliberately infiltrated a university parapsychology lab using simple sleight of hand just to make the researchers look foolish.
And that adversarial dynamic creates what many researchers view as an impossible standard of proof. The scientific establishment basically demands 100% on-command replicability for psychic phenomena.
But the historical data from the Stargate Project suggested that only about 1% of participants demonstrated truly exceptional remote viewing skill.
Exactly. If the ability is incredibly rare, and if it fluctuates based on mood, environment, or psychological conditions, then demanding flawless push-button replication in a hostile laboratory is an impossible standard.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me, because the standard we apply to human consciousness seems wildly different from the standard we apply to the rest of the physical universe.
It highlights the extreme limits of our current materialist paradigm.
Yeah.
I mean, modern physics accepts incredibly bizarre, counterintuitive concepts constantly. We accept the principles of quantum mechanics, where particles exist in superpositions, literally being in two states at once until they are measured. Physicists theorize about tachons, hypothetical particles that travel faster than the speed of light and move backward in time. We discuss advanced potentials, where the effect of a wave is mathematically perceived before the wave is even generated.
It's also weird.
Physics fully accepts that baseline reality is incredibly weird, yet the scientific establishment demands an impossibly flawless classical standard for human consciousness.
If physicists are already writing papers about particles that move backwards in time, why is it so impossible for mainstream science to accept that human consciousness might be operating on similarly weird quantum rules?
Because accepting weird physics doesn't fundamentally change how you live your life.
Oh, that's a good point.
A physicist can accept a tachon because it's safely contained within a mathematical equation on a chalkboard. But if human consciousness can actually bypass space and time, it means our fundamental understanding of who and what we are and how we connect to each other is deeply incomplete.
And that is a terrifying vacuum of knowledge for the ego to process. And so we return to the indifferent universe. The Cold War is over. The US and Soviet programs have been declassified, scrutinized, and packed away in archives.
Boxed up.
Yep. And we are left with a permanent stalemate. We have believers pointing to mathematically proven anomalies and skeptics pointing to methodological flaws, with both sides clinging tightly to their respective cognitive gravity. The universe doesn't care about our attempts to categorize it. It just keeps doing what it does.
And that is the ultimate takeaway from this history. This deep dive isn't just a historical curiosity about Cold War spies, leaky barracks, and psychotronic generators. It's really an exploration of how you process information.
Exactly. Think about how you react when you encounter a piece of data that completely shatters your worldview.
Right.
Do you sit with the discomfort? Do you accept the mystery? Or do you immediately invent a phantom narrative to protect your own cognitive gravity? Do you draft the ghost into the military just so you don't have to admit you don't understand what a ghost even is?
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over today. If consciousness really is an information field, as Edwin May's decision augmentation theory suggests, if our minds operate on rules closer to quantum mechanics than classical biology, what if the real psychic gap was never between the Americans and the Soviets?
Oh.
What if the real gap is between what the human mind is actually capable of experiencing and what our rigid scientific paradigms will allow us to see?
So the next time you hear a strange, unexplained noise in your attic, maybe don't rush to hand it a uniform. Maybe just sit in the dark for a minute and listen.